Dragons and Unicorns presents the Knights of the Apocalypse Tabards and Costumes for Hooded Man 3. You will need black fabric, gold fabric, bonding fabric, black and white thread, a cutting board, chalk marking pens, fabric cutting scissors, Fisker's embroidery scissors, McCall's Knight costume pattern 3658 or similar, a sewing machine, pins, hand sewing needles, a steaming cloth, an iron, metal ruler or yardstick, and tracing paper. This image was one of the first that came out for the publicity for the Knights of the Apocalypse and became my inspiration for our outfits for Hooded Man 3, a Robin of Sherwood convention run by Barnaby Eaton-Jones. There's a description of the overall look of the Knights in the narrative as a sun symbol on a black background, which gave me a general idea of the fabric I'd need to make the outfits, as well as their shape, which is always my starting point. I listened to the audio episode continuously before, during and after the making of the costumes. Because I always like what I make to have impact, after that first listen through, I knew I'd go for de Montbaume's Possession by Baphomet look for the Best Beloved's outfit, and a simple generic right for the rest of us. This is a very old pattern which I've had for many years, and is my go-to one for any knight's costume. It's sadly out of print now, but there are plenty of other ones of a similar style by other makers available. When buying a dress or costume pattern, always remember to work from your measurements in inches or centimetres and not your dress size. Commercial patterns don't bear any relation to UK dress sizes. A, because they're designed and made in America, and B, because your body is a totally different shape to the models they use to make the patterns, and I'll be making a video later on about fitting with commercial patterns. I worked out that for all the cloaks and tabards I'd need about 40 metres of fabric, as I knew I wanted more of a fantasy size cloak and hood rather than the more historically accurate tight medieval look. Here's my roll of crepe-backed satin in black, and as always this came from Fabricland's Salisbury shop. I shop there because they're so knowledgeable about their fabrics and very patient with me, as despite making a list before I go shopping, I always forget something just before or even after I've got to their cutting tables, and they cut it and added it all up on the cash register. But you can order direct from www.fabricland.co.uk. I've rolled out the fabric so that you can see both sides. You can use the matte or shiny surface for any project. It drapes beautifully, but has enough substance to give it a very structured look to your outfit. It's hard wearing and practical as it washes in the machine, and at currently $5.99 a metre, it isn't too expensive. Because I wanted the sun symbols to be the standout feature of these costumes, I decided to use the matte side of the fabric as the correct one. As always, my first job is to square up the top line in the material, and because I'd ordered the full 40 metres on rolls, it was cut in the factory, so it's usually squarer because of the machine they use. Before putting my pattern pieces down, I have to make sure the selvage edge is straight. If I cut it out with the fabric this wobbly, the pieces would stretch in odd ways, and make sure you level this on your table. I've pulled a lot of the material off the roll to make it easier to fold in half, and rested the whole thing on the chair so its own weight doesn't pull it off the cutting board while I'm working with it. Because I'm working on 5 versions of the same costume and cutting the pieces out more or less in one go, I make sure they don't get mixed up by finding bags of different colours for each person and marking them with the individual name, just like I have with these. I always cut the pattern out first from old sheets, curtain linings or duvet covers, bought from car boot sales or charity shops. Wash them and cut out your pattern pieces, tack them together, fit it to each person, mark their name on the pieces, and that toile goes in the relevant person's bag. Use the toile to cut each pattern, and when each outfit's been cut out, mark their name on it and the correct pieces go in that person's bag, together with the original toile, so there's no mix-ups. I always have my measurement sheets handy for everyone's costume because there are several things I need to check at each point of making the garment to get the fit right. As it happens, my daughter and I, as well as the best beloved and son-in-law, are very similar in height and basic measurements. So I can get away with using fewer toiles in this case because the knight's tabards don't have any real shaping to them and the cloaks are almost a full circle. Having cut the basic shape in the curtain lining and cut my tabard out, I've put my toile on my daughter and used a pen to mark where it'll need trimming to fit around her armhole and neckline. Here's a close-up of the line on the arm side, and then I've cut that line with my small scissors. My daughter's neckline is slightly different to mine, and so when I cut the front of her tabard, I have to add an inch to the neck's edge. And when I cut things out, I use whatever comes to hand as fabric weights, as long as it's clean and hold the fabric in place without slipping or falling off as I cut the material. It really doesn't matter. Pieces are cut on selvage, and as the best beloved is wider than my son-in-law, I've moved the pattern piece an inch further away from the selvage, and when I cut the one for the son-in-law, I'll move it towards the numbers to make it smaller. Because of the round shape of the best beloved, I tend to cut his outfits with a straight hem at the front and also the line when it's finished in its final stages, as the front needs to allow for his tongue and will be a different length to the back. The blue line here shows where the back hem will be cut, and the straight hem for the front piece will help the tabard sit properly over his tummy. The approximate waistline is marked on the pattern pieces, and I've transferred these marks to the toile, and you'll see the reason why this is needed later on. The waistline is also marked on the back centre seam, and as this has been cut on the selvage, there'll be no need to overstitch that edge, saving me a bit of time. So that I'm not wasting fabric, I'm using the excess from the backs to create the facings for the front split, because the fold of the fabric ends up being cut away. I mark the offcut as the front facing with my chalk marker, and this will then wash out when the garment's finished. I use the inch lines on my cutting board to square the front facing down to a 5-inch width. The length will be cut down when I have the correct measurement, which you'll see later on. I use my yardstick to draw a chalk line, as you can see here, and I mark and cut the other side and the approximate length, allowing for the extra turning at the top of the facing. I then fold the facing in half lengthwise and iron that centre line ready for cutting the split. Having cut the main tabard, I then cut a second pair of fronts and backs, but shorter, to make a long facing. Normally facings are only about 4 inches, 12 centimetres long, but with these tabards, the sleeves being putted in are knitted, and they'll need the extra long facings to help counteract the heavy pull of the weight in the wool. It'll also help the finished tabards hang much better. Every piece of the tabard now has to be edged with an overlocking stitch. To make the stitch easier for you to see, I've sewn it with white thread on an offcut of the black fabric. On average, it'll take between 15 and 30 minutes for each pattern piece to be edged. It does take a long time, but I know that these costumes will last for years of wash and wear because I've spent the time stopping those edges from fraying. This offcut has also been overlocked. On the left side is the distortion that happens if you stretch the fabric whilst edging it, rather than on the right side where I've allowed the feed dogs on the machine to move the material and only held it to keep it in place on the machine. On the actual tabards, I don't want the overlocking stitches to be seen, so they'll be sewn in black thread. Now I've done all the edgings on my tabards, it's time to cut the sun symbols. Because this griffin comes with the tabard pattern, I use that to guesstimate the size I need for the suns. As you can see, it's about 8.5 inches or just over 20 centimetres. This is the gold fabric I'm using for the suns on all of the cloaks and tabards. Here I took a 12-inch or 30.5 centimetre square and cut a rough circle from it. Remember, if you cut something too large, you can always cut it down, but if you cut it too small, you're wasting fabric and money. I've marked the centre of the gold circle with a pin and laid the front piece of the tabard flat out on my board. I know I'll need a 6-inch or 15 centimetre split down the front of the tabard in order that it'll fit over our heads. So I've marked that measurement with a straight chalk line and placed an X where I think the centre of the sun symbol should sit. I used the centre of the cross to push the pin in, so the middle of the sun is where I estimated the position needs to be. As you can see, the top of the circle is quite far over the bottom of the split, so I need to make that circle smaller and move it down slightly. Remember those waistline marks I told you to place on the fabric? Well, using those in my yardstick, I've measured across from them and put a chalk line in the centre to see how much further down I can move the sun before it becomes too low down the chest and sits on the stomach instead. I know now that 8 inches, 21 centimetres, is going to be the size of the sun that I need to have, and using my small guide ruler, I've moved the placement of the centre of the symbol down to 4 inches or 10 centimetres from the split. This circle is definitely too large for the tabards, but I feel that it'll be the perfect size to go on the back of the cloaks. So I kept this circle and cut another one out of the gold metallic fabric. I folded the second circle in half and then into a quarter, and carefully I've cut the circle at the 4-inch mark. Circle completed. The edges are a bit rough, but as I'm cutting the sun symbol out of it, that's not going to matter, and now it fits much better. I put the picture of the sun symbol onto my computer screen, making it the 8 inches or just over 20 centimetres I wanted, and traced around the top part of the shape with a soft pencil. Then I took a marker pen and went over those lines. Folding the tracing in half and using a pair of nail scissors to get into the tight points, I cut the sun symbol out of the tracing paper and placed it on the tabard front to double check how it will look. Oh, I like it! Knowing I'd need both small and large sun symbols, I traced and cut out a larger size. I then cut the squares of foil I'd need and ironed on a fabric bonding glue, which is available by the metre, and traced the sun symbol onto the backing paper. I traced and cut each symbol until I had 3 of the large suns to go on the back of our cloaks and 7 of the smaller ones, 4 to go on the tabards and 3 to go on the left sides of the front of the cloaks. Smaller ones were made for my granddaughter's version, as she was only 5 at the time. The Best Beloved's cloak had a different design, as his was the possessed flame style. Here's the gold side of the sun, and you can see how the angle you're looking at it from changes the way the fabric reflects the light, which gives the fiery look I was looking for. Having my chalk marks to guide me, and using a steaming cloth and the iron set on a medium warm level, I carefully ironed the sun onto each of the fronts of the tabards. Using the waistline marks and my yardstick, I measured and chalked the precise centre of the tabard front and the centre of the front hem, which worked out at 19 inches or just over 48 centimetres. Obviously your measurements will be different, as this was the Best Beloved's tabard. I drew a chalk line between the 2 points, and I pinned the tabard together and put it on the Best Beloved to check the placement of the split. That sun symbol looks so good. We put his belt on, and as you can see, the marked split is too high. It should be at just above crutch level. It's important with costumes to use any accessories you intend to wear with it during your first fittings, as they always change the way a costume hangs. The mark's a mere inch below the belt, which isn't the look I was going for. I've placed a pin, very carefully, where I want the split to end, and yes, I do accidentally pin into the person instead of just the fabric sometimes. Get used to it. My small guide ruler helps me remark where the pin is and the top of the split will end. Using my small scissors, I've carefully cut the line of the front split up to the new mark and cut the front facing to match, with a top seam allowance of 3 inches or 7.5 centimetres. Having overlocked the edge of the facing and the centre split in the tabard, I pinned the facing in place with the right sides together. Using a straight stitch, I've sewn the facing to the tabard front, clipped into the top corners and then overlocked the clips. These are really likely to fray, so overlocking, if you want your costume to last, is essential. The facing seams have to be pressed towards the inside edge of the tabard to ensure it'll lay flat, and I've pressed the seams from the right sides as well. Now I've pinned the facing back, ready for ironing it again, removing the pins as I iron, or it'll leave marks on the finished piece, which will show. The facing is now good and flat. It's ready to be basted in place. Basting helps to keep everything neat, and I usually leave the stitches in until the night before the costume's going to be worn. Then I either iron it or use a garment steamer to get rid of the holes and marks left by the thread. Here I'm marking the width of the side seams. It'll only be sewn from the underarm to the waistline and then have to be folded back down the open part so the trim can be put on. This is one of the sleeves which I knitted for the nights in a grey acrylic, which has a shiny silver thread accent through it, making it look a little more like real chainmail. The sleeves are knitted with a rounded top, exactly the same shape that a cut sleeve would be, but unlike a normal sleeve, there's no left and right, so they're much easier to fit. To make it easier to place the sleeve in the armhole, I've placed a pin where the seam would be on a cut sleeve and put one in the centre of the top to mark where it'll attach to the shoulder seam of the tabard. Because in the knitted sleeves, I'm using the stretch stitch on my sewing machine to put them in. Having put the tabard together and pressed all the seams open, I've started pinning the knitted sleeve into the armhole. Remember that, as with any sewing, the right sides of the fabric, and in this case the knitting, need to be facing each other when you pin the sleeves in. Always begin pinning the sleeve in at the underarm seam and ensure the seams are pinned flat. I put the pins into the underarm seam first and then pinned the top centre into the shoulder seam. I've returned to the underarm seam and continued placing pins either side of the seam until the whole sleeve is in place. Now the arm is fully pinned in and ready to sew. I only pin in one sleeve at a time, so that the pins can't get tangled up or pulled out while I'm sewing, causing problems later. Using the sleeve arm on the machine, I carefully place the armhole on it. I start at the underarm seam, working slowly around the sleeve, checking every couple of inches that it isn't caught up on the machine. If that happens, you could end up trying to remove the seam because the sleeve has a huge fold in the wrong place. Not only will it cost you time, but because of a knitted sleeve, you could end up cutting through the stitches and having the whole sleeve start to unravel on you. Not a good look. I'm working slowly around the arm's eye, removing each pin as I get to it. Now that takes time, but you can check your sleeve's position between every couple of pins. As I approach the beginning of the stitching, I remove the last pin, stitch over the seam, reverse the stitching and then stitch forward again before stopping and cutting the threads. The shoulder seam is a stress point, and so I do tend to stitch across the seam, reverse back over it, and then carry on sewing around the sleeve. Here you can see a close-up of how the underarm seam has been sewn, reversed over, and then sewn forward again to give that neat and secure finish. Because the gold sleeves for the Best Beloveds tabard are a cut pattern rather than a knitted sleeve, I've just used a straight stitch instead of the stretch one to attach those. To finish the hems on the tabards, having checked the hem levels on each of them, I've basted down the facings and used white thread and the very longest straight stitch setting to measure the hem. By the way, I hate hemming anything. Using the white stitches as a guide, I've folded the hem down and pinned it into place, and folded it up once more and pinned it ready for hand sewing. I could have sewn it on the machine with a black thread, but that will always leave a line, and that can be seen. It wasn't a look I wanted for these outfits. Now I've removed the white machine tacking threads and placed the pins to make it easier for stitching. I've threaded my needle with a double length of black thread, and starting down in the bottom of the hem on the outside edge with a knot, I'm using small stitches in a cross whip stitch. In the previous picture, the needle was going from the bottom to the top, and now it's going from top to bottom. Repeating those stitches close together will close the side of the hem. Here you can see the tiny stitches I'm using to sew the hem to make sure there are as few marks as possible seen on the front of the outfit when it's worn. And having worked all the way across the hem, I'm now working down the other side with the whip stitch to keep it closed. I've stitched together the facings and attached them onto the tabard at the neck, notched the curves, overlocked the cuts, pressed the seams, basted around the neckline and pinned down the armhole seams before sewing them with a straight stitch. Because the facings won't show, I've hemmed them on the machine, as you can see with that stitch line, as I said it would, and sewn in any loose ends. I had a choice of trims to be used on the tabards and pinned them in place to see whether they fitted with the overall look that I was going for. This is too bright a gold and looks ugly and garish. This trim's reversible, so I've pinned it in place both ways round to see which effect I prefer. I also didn't want to add a third shade of gold into the costume, so I draped it over the sleeve to check the colour match of the trim, and I was quite happy with it. But at the end of the day, I decided it all looked much better without a neck trim at all. And these next photos show the finished tabards with all the trims in place. The back didn't need any trim at all because the cloak over the outfit would mean you couldn't see the back anyway. These were the medieval hose-style leggings I knitted for the knights. As they wouldn't be seen under the full outfits, there was no need to make full leggings, and it also meant that we wouldn't get quite so hot and sweaty. As you can see here, with black tights on, Underneath, there were no embarrassing gaps anyway, and when you add the cloaks over the top, nothing shows. Finally, the tabards are finished, and I'm ready to move on to making the cloaks that they'll be worn with. To see that video, please subscribe to our channel and remember to like and share, as this really helps us. Thanks for watching, everyone. Blessings and light to you all. Big dragon and unicorn hugs.